We're really excited to be doing this, and hopefully, it's one of many more to come. My name is Miranda, and I'm the Director of Community Growth and Impact at WiDS, and excited to be hosting this conversation on AI readiness today. What does that mean? So this is meant to be less of a presentation, more of a dialogue. So we're really inviting all of you to participate in the chat. And if time allows, we'll open up the floor to questions. So you all can, contribute, ask other follow-up questions, share your own experiences and thoughts, etc. This conversation was informed by a lot of what we've heard from our community and what we've seen in the industry. So we want to continue to have you share your thoughts with us. All right. So while we're waiting for people to continue to join, I'd love to do a quick warm up on the topic. So in the chat, if you could share in one word or one phrase, let's keep it concise. What does being AI ready mean to you at this point in time? While we While you all work on that, I'll introduce my colleagues. I'm joined by Bryan Muñoz, who is our Director of Datathons and AI Learning. And Bryan is bringing both an industry and community perspective today. So he'll be exploring how AI readiness looks like from both lenses. And we're going to be discussing topics that we've seen, again, come up in the community, up in industry, and then from anything that you all bring up forward today. And we're also joined by Amy Jaggard, who is our Director of Programs, and she's going to be helping us moderate the conversation in the chat. So we encourage you to engage there. All right, let's see what's coming up here. Some of the things, AI readiness is a tool. AI readiness is understanding how to practically leverage the popular LLMs like ChatGPT, Claude in the workplace, personally and at the organization level. AI readiness is production ready and responsible AI. We'll talk a little bit more about responsible AI. I'll share some questions or some comments that came in from our community platform. AI readiness implies the question, are you ready to effectively integrate AI into your daily work? I feel like this is something that if we don't keep up with it, we will be left in the dust.
Great response.
Right. AI readiness is curious, makes them curious but skeptical. Don't use AI just because it's shiny. Ask what problem it solves. Another person shared, it means to them, how automated and simplified are you? Gwen shared, excited to experiment, but paying attention to ethics and ROI. Good idea. All right. Let's see. All right. We're about 7 minutes past the hour. I think we have a good number of participants. So let's get started. Thanks to everybody who shared what it means to them right now. I'm going to turn it over to Bryan, who's going to share his perspective.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. As Lauren mentioned and introduced me, I'm Bryan Muñoz. I'm the Director of AI Learning and Datathon here at WiDS. And I want to thank all of you for taking the time to come and join us on this conversation. As Lauren mentioned, this is a conversation that we would like to have and learn from because we're trying to build out the next generation of AI talent. And one of the most important aspects of doing that is listening to the community. That being said, I want to start out with having a dialogue about what's happening in the industry. And I'm going to drop in the chat one of the research reports that I like to review every now and then. And that is from the Center of Audit Quality. So part of the reason why we're having this conversation is to understand your perspectives of what industry is looking for and what your perception is from the people out in the field. But what's happening inside the companies is a little bit more opaque. And so where do we look for the information to decipher where artificial intelligence is going in enterprises outside of the big shiny OpenAI and other companies. So we look into SEC filings, specifically 10Ks, because that's where they are the most transparent about their practices. And one of the components that they are mentioning is from 2023 to 2024, there was a 50% increase in companies reporting their utilization of artificial intelligence. How it becomes a little bit much more opaque because I like to tell this story all the time. I won't mention the company, but this company made a public announcement through their CEO speech on an earnings call, and they said, "We're moving AI into our production. We are really fast gearing our teams to adopt AI." And then when you look at the SEC filings and you read the fine print, they say, "Utilize ChatGPT for our marketing campaign." Which is really interesting and a little bit humorous because there is this perception that companies are integrating artificial intelligence right into their organization, into their processes, but a lot of them are still figuring it out. As you will see when you have some time looking at some of the audit reports, a lot of them are purchasing and acquiring AI companies that fit into their processes. What those processes are is where that opaqueness is. So now when we think about what it means to be AI ready, I think it has a few dimensions that you can consider. It's the dimension of whether an enterprise is ready to ingest artificial intelligence into the processes. Can it integrate into how your organization works from not just marketing, but to your operations, building out your sales funnel, developing maybe a product or tool, any of these components, that's what, from an enterprise standpoint, I think we're looking at. But more importantly, and to the mission of WIDS, is how does this impact people? And how do people become AI ready? Just to give you a little bit of context and background of where I come from academia. I ran the Master of Data Science at UC Irvine for several years and have been involved with faculty there and have been involved with faculty across the country. And one of the consistent gaps that we have, or that we have seen, and maybe I shouldn't say we, but that I have seen, is that there's a lot of cognitive offloading from students, utilizing really quick prompts to develop an output and then saying that that is sufficient when in reality, it's not sufficient. There needs to be, I think some of you mentioned, critical thought and questioning as to the outputs of this. And I think this is the component where we need to think about AI readiness as a critical thinking gap that we need to address for people in general. These are very good tools. They have and serve their purpose to a very limited dimension, but they are not the silver bullet that they're otherwise marketed as. Again, they are really extremely helpful tools, so I don't want to detract from it. But without engaging them responsibly, I think this is where there's a few pitfalls. So I think that's the background and context of how I want to frame the conversation, and I want to frame it in twofold. What does it mean to be AI ready as a user and as probably a practitioner? And then what does it mean to be AI ready as an enterprise? What does that look like within your organizations? Do you have maybe case studies or use cases, I should say, that you can share within the limited scope? But I think this is where I would like to engage all of you and learn what you're thinking and have an organic dialogue.
Awesome. Thanks for that background and level setting, Bryan. So as you mentioned, we've heard from our community in the chat, and as you mentioned, there's different ways to kind of think about and apply AI, both in a personal way and in enterprise way. So it's used in a lot of different ways. So give us some grounding. When we talk about being AI ready ourselves, are we talking about using AI tools effectively or building AI systems ourselves?
The way that I think of AI readiness is understanding the tool first. I think when large language models came out and became popularized in 2022, I'm trying not to single out one particular company, but when these type of tools come out, we gravitate towards them because they're fancy, they're new. But I think the component where it helps us become AI ready is to really understand what levers these tools are using to deliver their outputs. So there's a lot of statistics involved when it comes to these large language models. There's a concept that I like to tell all my students about, and that's statistical convergence, where it brings everything towards the median and to the average. So while the LLM has really good output sometimes, it is bringing everyone to the middle. So it doesn't really do a good job of having edge cases. It's also important to understand what those edge cases are and how you can push the boundaries of large language models in certain directions. And it's not just large language models; it's also DALL-E models for visual outputs, sound models. They all have this kind of same architecture, if you will, that limits them. And I think we need to understand what the limitations are of the model before we can truly engage with them and have really good uses of the tool. That then can you can start building on that foundation into, okay, how do I structure this prompt to answer A, B, and C? The other component is you have to have some level of domain expertise because it is really good at predicting the next words, the next sentences. But if you don't know the full domain, you are going to fall into a confirmation bias where you are going to be over reliant on that information. So you have to have a certain degree of expertise and confidence in your own knowledge or have the capacity to verify and fact check to make sure that you're going on the right path and then cross-validate with other people to ensure that that output is good. I think one of the either comments or questions that we received on the forum was, are you responsible or are you ready to take responsibility for the output of an AI? And I think that is the maybe the gate question that we need to answer. Are you willing to take a responsibility for that output? And if you are, maybe that can be a signal that you're AI ready.
Yeah. Do you see a distinction in the way that that's playing out in the workplace right now between those two, using AI tools and building them? And this, if anybody wants to chime in what they're seeing in their workplace, please drop it in the chat or raise your hand and I'll call on you. But let's go to Bryan first.
Yeah, I'm not going to call out the specific companies, but once I tell you the sort of the baseline facts, you'll be able to deduce it. But the major consulting company that had to refund 400,000 to a government because the domain expert went in and fact checked the report that they delivered to this government and saw a lot of erroneous data. And so these are professionals with a really extraordinary background, domain expertise, yet they fell for a lot of the same traps. And they were overconfident on the capabilities of a large language model. And it's not just this use case where, it's made the headlines. There's university professors who are developing research and are leaving the output saying, oh, if you want, I can develop a mixed methods uh, test so that it makes the qualitative study much more robust, and it's published in a major journal, right? So I think one, there's a little bit of over reliance on these models, but two, I think there's a little bit of hubris that we feel so confident that we've reviewed these outputs or have such high confidence in the technology itself that we fall prey to it. So I think that's one of the biggest components to be cautious about.
Yeah. Anyone from our community have anything to add?
I mean, what I would like to hear from the community here is what is your perspective? How do you challenge our large language models or any type of AI models? What do you see are some of the ways that you can engage with these systems and really make them useful for yourself? And Hari, I see your hand up.
Yeah, thanks for the discussion. One thing that comes to mind is the balance between leveraging these tools for like really to streamline things. Like, for example, using Claude to do some research and create an Excel doc, and it has all these built-in skills that allow us to kind of, for example, do some research that would have otherwise taken a long time. And on the other hand, I think a lot about like how important it is for us as humans to process things by looking things up, by writing our notes down, by engaging with the stuff rather than just having it kind of fed to us. So that's one thing that I've kind of thought about recently, which is that it's great that these efficiencies are there, but it's also easy maybe to not fully process what's being shared. And then in turn, it's hard for me, for example, if I'm getting research from an LLM to then tell my colleagues, here's what I found. Like I actually have to end up doing that work later by reviewing what it came up with. But I skip the cognitive processing step that I would have previously done because I've kind of not engaged directly in the research myself. So it's just one example of something that I've thought about recently.
That's a great example. Anyone else want to share about some of the ways that they're engaging and what they struggle with or how they push back on these AI systems?
No? All right.
I think one
Good.
no, sorry, Lauren. I think there was a little bit of a lag. But Hari, you bring up a really good point about cognitive offloading. And one of the things that I think would be helpful is you debate with the LLM. It will help you engage with the content, and I don't want to say it will replace the effort that it goes into for you to manually go and search for the research. But think about working with these systems as more as a junior analyst or someone that needs your guidance on how to search for the information. And so through this process, this is how I do it when I'm looking for research is um, one of the things that I'm currently interested in is biometric information. And how do we categorize biometric data and what are the more novel ways that this type of information is being collected and then commercialized? And so my question to the LLM is, we have a few dimensions of biometric data that are very common: fingerprints, iris scans, facial structures, blood types. Um, it's getting to the point where even the cameras are able to detect the amount of melanin in our skin. So there's a lot of different components. And so I ask, what is the most nascent research on biometric information? And what will falsify the claims that you are making and inputting into the prompt. And so it re-engages with me and says, okay, here's a few different words that I found in research. These are ways that it could falsify that claim. And then looking up those sources as well. Because one of the limitations of LLMs, if you've been an active user, is it doesn't do well with images or PDFs. And that's because they treat them as images, not text files. And so if you want to get the best output, you have to convert everything to a text file so that it can then have a really solid understanding of what you're doing. And then you have to chunk it out even further because it loses the context window depending on the large language model that you're using. So having going back to what I mentioned earlier in the conversation, having an understanding of what the limitations are then gives you a process and a way of where you can structure your thinking, and I don't want to say replace the effort that you would have if you didn't have this tool, but re-engage that effort in a new way with these tools as part of your daily workflow.
Yeah, that's really helpful and great guidance to think about. You can't just like take it at face value. Like, how do you actually prompt it to use it more effectively? All right, so let's talk a little bit more about AI integration within organizations, or industry. So, what have you seen? Have you seen any industries that have done a good job of integrating AI, or which ones are lagging? And this is a great question for the community too. You don't have to give away your company or anything, but what have you all seen as well?
I think this is an interesting question because part of the valuation for these companies is this whole notion of integrating AI into the workplace. And we've heard from a lot of the major players who have said, oh, we've integrated this particular LLM into our workflow so that it's reading our emails and processing the information, right? That's all well and good because I think I speak for a lot of us that emails really do inundate our processes. They engage us in a very heavy cognitive load, um, but we still have to go back and verify and fact check, and it ends up causing a lot more work. I have yet to see from SEC filings, financial reports, mergers or acquisitions of a successful use case on artificial intelligence.
Hmm.
There's a very popular MIT study that's being cited. However, I have to disclose that there's limitations into the sample size of the companies, the sample size of the industries, where they're articulating that over 95% of AI integration tools are failing because they don't know how to integrate these tools, right?
Wow.
And so when we think about integrating tools, I think you need to determine if you have enough of the data, if you have the infrastructure to process that data, and the quality of that data, right? Because if we bring it back to the utilization of large language models, your output is only as good as the input that you're providing to it, right? So if, for example, a nonprofit is telling its board, I'm integrating AI, do you have enough data to process all that information? And is that data high quality data that's going to make a significant difference in your enterprise? And so as we start scaling up in different organizations, that becomes a bigger and broader challenge, especially when you're dealing with clients. And the last point before I get to Rashida is the Oxford Insights, and the Oxford University has an Oxford Insights on government readiness and with artificial intelligence. I think it's really, really great to skim through it and read. But one of the reasons why artificial intelligence is being limited in enterprise adoption is because how do you deploy it safely and legally, right? There's a lot of legal ramifications that come, especially in service industries. And it really puts you in a bind. So I'll pause there and I'll hand it up to Rashida.
Yeah.
Hi, hi everyone. It's funny that you mentioned government. I was actually going to speak on a contract that I have with one agency, and they allow no third-party AI use at all. They have created, I'll call it an in-house um, AI tool, and it is very limited because you can only use documentation that is created in-house. And so, that limits the use of it. But it's just, it, I mean, I get it and it makes sense. And I'm actually on board with it. Um, because, for security reasons, we don't know what we're getting ourselves into at this point. Um, so I think more research needs to be done and, on this topic.
I love that you bring that up because it brings the conversation to balancing two sides of an equation. right? You have organizations who are eager to deploy artificial intelligence solutions, and then you have the computational side of the equation. Do you have the capacity to really build an infrastructure that's going to be conducive to this, right? When we think about these institutions, these enterprises that are monetizing large language models, they have data centers, they have cloud infrastructure, they have engineers working around the clock to fine tune the model. When you bring that down to a more micro scale, or even a large scale like government enterprises, they're very slow moving. And we all know that in technology, you cannot be slow. You have to be able to adapt and be nimble as the technology evolves. But you really need to have a lot of those resources in order to have this computational power to facilitate and service you. So, as you'll see in the Oxford Index about government readiness, a lot of it has to do with regulation, insurance, uh, basically keeping everything above board. And I think that's a very prudent approach because if you install, and we've seen this from large language models where you share different files, is people can extract that knowledge base with the right prompts. I just did a study with one of our WIDS interns on the utilization of custom large language models to not utilize a proprietary name for that company. And I challenged them to ask the LLM prompts until it revealed the knowledge base. It did it in 2 prompts. So it's not really that difficult to inject questions that will get to a knowledge base. And so when you think about government agencies that are placing thousands of documents, it is really scary to think about the information that can be released. Something interesting that I heard today, and I wish I had the particular source, but I heard it as I was listening to a video, is that while large language models are huge, 14 billion parameters, 7 billion parameters, and so on and so forth, do you all know, this is an interesting fact, do you all know how many documents it takes for it to break the LLM and give it a backdoor? I found this to be really, really fascinating. Does anyone want to take a guess?
Based on how you're framing it, not that many.
Yeah, definitely not that many, but please take a guess. Humor me.
Ari says
10, it's a little bit low, a little bit higher,
50.
a little bit higher. One more guess.
65.
Getting closer. It's 250 documents. So 250 documents has been the reported amount of documents that contain some sort of malicious information straight from the web that will break an entire LLM. And it doesn't matter how large you scale the large language model. So, most open source start at around 7 billion parameters, and then they keep going up. Right. I think one of the most advanced right now is 23 billion parameters. But even at the 23 billion parameter mark, 250 documents, PDFs, or text files that contain malicious information will break the LLM to give you an answer anything. So that's why when you utilize some of these large language models, they have a file size limit of 10 and about, 200 to 400 megabytes of data that you can upload at once, because they're cautious that you're going to inject enough documents into your chat that it will then break the model for you. So this is an interesting use case where now if we think about governments, and we think about foreign agents, it would be really easy if, for example, the US government was using one of these enterprise models and a foreign actor were interested and then uploaded a certain amount of documents to jailbreak it, right? It's the same kind of concept that was happening with another popular service that we all use for email. where they started inserting their AI features to read and analyze your email and give you kind of a good snippet to make your life a little bit easier. Good intentions, but now when you introduce marketing emails or even phishing emails, they have hidden prompts in form of blank text that you don't see. And then when your LLM reads your emails, now a prompt has been injected into your computer and it's able to extract information. And there's been multiple use cases of this happening, which is why one of the particular companies in question has received a notice or has let their users know if they don't want to opt into these features, they should turn that off. So it's something to consider when it comes to artificial intelligence and LLM's use. But I think we've deviated a little bit away from the AI readiness. But I think it's still the ground truth that you need to understand the limitations. I think that that is a core component of what it means to be AI ready. Understanding the limitations then allows you to understand what works, what doesn't work, how you can navigate yourself within the system, and then integrate any kind of solutions that you want into your enterprise.
Great. Any questions or comments for Bryan? No? I feel like we're starting to move into this already, and I think it's on a lot of our mind. But we all have a lot of, I think, questions and concerns about responsibility. And as AI becomes more embedded in our work and our everyday lives, you know, who is responsible for how it's used? Is it like us as practitioners? Is it, leadership is the people that are building the systems? I would imagine it's kind of a combination of all, but, what are your thoughts, Bryan?
I think this is in a legal debate right now, right? I don't want to bring those cases to the limelight, but there's a lot of instances where there's misuse and student people that are being impacted in heavily negative ways. And where the accountability starts and ends is currently being debated in legal systems. So I don't want to take a particular stand on it, not because I just don't have sufficient evidence to put a stronghold on an argument. Personally, I believe there's a lot of reasons why the AI companies should be responsible for the outputs and the components. From a practical standpoint, what does that mean for these tools? And what does that mean for the rest of us when it comes to utilizing these tools? Should there be a component where we need to get licensure, similar to financial advisors or even attorneys or even doctors to utilize these tools, that we've undergone some sort of training to engage with them in a healthy manner, right? But then that goes into a whole other debate on your freedoms, right? To utilize a product in the way that you wish. So I think there's a lot of debate at that macro level. I think in an organizational and individual level, from an individual standpoint, you should, as we started the conversation, you should be responsible for the AI outputs. If you produce them and you're putting them forward, you are responsible for that. That is where the full stop accountability factor is. And then when we think about organizations, if an organization is authorizing the utilization of these tools, that organization, in my opinion, is responsible for whatever output that is. And I think that's consistent with what occurred in the Indo-Pacific and that consulting firm.
Do you have any thoughts on how organizations could create a culture where, like, using AI is everyone's responsibility, not just like the technical teams, but like anybody who's, employing any sort of AI tools that, the workforce is using?
I think this is where we start talking about cultural shift within an organization, right? And I think this is a consistent challenge across the board with an adoption of any kind of new system or uh, form of thinking within an enterprise. And I think the first step is acknowledging, one, that artificial intelligence is here, and you as an organization and as a team should take a decision. Do we use it or do we not use it? And then stick to that. I think that's important because while leadership has the biggest stake in and establishing the direction of the use of artificial intelligence, the people that are working for you and are integrating themselves into your organization should have a voice in that. Um, I think that is healthy with an organization, but I think that discussion needs to be had. And I agree with you. I don't think it should be just left to the technical teams. And there should be frank discussions about what are the use cases, what is okay to upload in terms of data that's from the enterprise, in what capacity does that data get uploaded, or how is it maintained secured? How do you engage with the large language models and what capacity? I think there's a lot of healthy discussions that you can have as an organization. But I think the organization needs to decide and acknowledge that AI is here.
Yeah. Yeah, I really wonder how many organizations are having those conversations. If yours is, we'd love to know. But we have a couple questions from the chat. Hari said, what is the WIDS perspective on how data science and CS students should be balancing or leveraging AI as a coding support tool in the classroom versus learning to do everything themselves?
That is a great question. I think why we're having these conversations is to help define that position. I think pedagogically across the United States and across the globe, there's a lot of different and competing schools of thought in to what extent the AI tool should be a tool to help and augment you as an individual, and how much of it is going to offload the work, in this case, coding, and developing apps. From a personal perspective, I think it is a tool. And what I have consistently told faculty that I have engaged with is by utilizing these tools, you should not necessarily evaluate the foundations anymore, but rather the augmentation between what the AI output gets you to and what the value in Delta the student adds to that output. So something from Boston University, they've done this in their classrooms where they evaluate that delta in their midterms and finals now, where they say, okay, great, utilize large language models. You can use anyone that you want. You have this particular task of developing, let's say, a random forest to get these particular metrics. But we would like to see is your prompts, the outputs for each prompt, and the final product that you deliver has to have a 20% delta difference between what is outputted and the value that you're submitting into this assignment. That's
Show
where
your
we're going to
work,
start your
right?
grading. Yeah, that's where we're going to start grading is, okay, from that 20%, how much do you significantly change that output? So when we think about that and start thinking about how WIDS will frame that, I think that is an interesting point to start. Is how much do we push that forward?
Yeah. Gwen had another question. For organizations that choose to allow the use of AI, do you think there needs to be documentation or citing of output being generated by AI?
I actually wrote about this 100%. But I think I go back to how much did you significantly change? And it is now more of you versus AI. I think if it's a preponderance of evidence that it's AI, you should always cite. If
Mm,
it's now changed, morphed, and developed you can always reference it and say it's AI was used in the development of this, but it's no longer the ownership of the artificial intelligence model. At least that's how I have framed it. And the reason for that is because when you think about the output, you have to consistently change that output to make it into a quality output. Especially if you use it consistently, you see a lot of the pitfalls. One of the particular models, as you all probably know, use the M dash notoriously. They recently updated the model, but they have replaced it with something much more interesting, which is a colon. So now, if you look at the outputs, there is now consistent utilization of colons. And if you're a writer, you know that colons are very rarely used in any kind of reporting or outside of like academic research. Colons are very limited. And so it's really interesting to see that. So when you adapt the outputs, you really have to change the architecture of that to make it even remotely yours. But I think it will always be something that you reference and say, I utilized AI to develop this. I think that's the most responsible thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Liliana asks, why is data governance important? It's a big question.
Yeah, super big question. Data governance is important because it mitigates risk, plain and simple. Governance sets the ground rules, sets the rules of engagement with large language models. So what data you're going to keep private, what data you're going to share, how this data is being processed, the data provenance, where you're sourcing this data, how you're sourcing this data, and how is it going to be utilized? I think those are all questions that need to be addressed when it comes to governance policies. And also who has access to that, because not everyone needs access to that particular data, right? It's part of good, healthy data practices. So in terms of why it's important to maintain the integrity of the data, protect the organization, and ensure that you have the rules of engagement, not only within your organization, but now with third-party models.
Great. Thanks, everyone, for your questions. These are great. So we're going to move into a couple of questions that we have gotten on our community platform in preparation for this meeting. But again, continue to add more questions that come up in the chat. So one person asked, as AI systems become more capable of autonomous decision-making, what frameworks should we prioritize to ensure transparency and accountability at scale?
That's a great question. I have to think about it for a second.
It is, yeah, I mean, anybody see any frameworks that are being used in your organizations?
I'm going to ground this into the utilization of AI agents, right? And I'm going to ground this in a financial case. Okay. So let's say you are an individual who wants to now break into investing, and you ask the large language model or the AI model to develop a financial strategy to invest your funds. Now, you didn't input the risk, you didn't input some of the variables that maybe a financial and fiduciary advisor will ask you. And the large language model now took an autonomous agent and started developing a financial strategy for you. In doing so, they do one of the more lucrative investment strategies, which is hedging. They do some put options or buybacks, and now you're in the hole. And that's actually what's happened to several different people, is they've utilized agents and they went into the hole close to 700,000 because they played on options. They didn't set the ground rules for how this autonomous AI system was going to invest, right? The investment strategy that they're utilizing is not nearly in real time because it's still trying to predict what it should do. But you, just as we as people can't predict the future of how the market is going to take news or things are going to happen in real time, the AI system doesn't have that foresight either.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we engage into these systems with autonomous capability, I think the buck stops with the individual, the person who decided to set the workflow for the autonomous agent. In this case, it's, I think, a little bit much more egregious because there's a lot of different components that you need to keep into account when you're developing a financial strategy. I'm not a financial expert, so this is not financial advice. But if they had engaged with a fiduciary person that knew the guardrails, maybe they would have not selected a strategy that was so aggressive and ended up in the hole. So, in terms of frameworks, we should prioritize for accountability and transparency. I think something that the AI companies need to do is outline their logic and how they're going to be able to how they're processing that information and allow that to be auditable and ask questions. And I think there should be a lot more stop gaps in that automated process. So one of the components with one of the LLMs that I utilize, when you give it an agent task, it goes on its own for 15, 20, 30 minutes, depending on the task, and it gives you a log at the end. In order to be more accountable and transparent, it should give you stop points. I have executed A. Based on this information, this might change the direction of how I process the next step. What is your recommendation, or how would you like me to proceed? And I think that would be a good framework.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the day, these models are working based on probability. And if we as people can't see what the probability is going to be for a specific consequence to the action we're deciding to take, then I think one, the responsibility falls on the individual, but two, you probably shouldn't engage with them to that degree.
Yeah, I mean, so much of what I'm hearing you say, Bryan, is that AI is not a replacement for tasks. It's a tool, but the human element of how we use these things is essential. We cannot just
Mhm.
plug it in and walk away. Like we really have to understand it and work with it for it to execute and accomplish the tasks effectively in the way that we want it to.
Yeah,
We can't just, assume it's going to understand everything we as humans understand in the context and what we want it to actually produce, and we also need to understand the risks of using them. So all very, very
100%.
interesting. With our few minutes left, I know this is a question you get a lot, and we all do at our team, but there's a lot of curiosity right now from people who want to break into AI that are in a completely different field. What would you say to them as, the industry is growing and, young graduates are entering the workforce or people are considering career transitions? What would you suggest? Like how do you break into this industry?
Well, that's a tough question. I always start with asking what aspect of AI you want to kind of focus on. And this has been my consistent question since 2009 when business analytics started and got popular, then it shifted to data science. Um, AI has curved a lot of the different programs. And what I mean by this, it started to segment a lot faster than, for example, data science and business analytics. When those topics started, that umbrella term was used for very many years before it was segmented out into, oh, well, you can be a marketing analyst, you can be a financial analyst, you can be XYZ analyst. And then with data science, it started to become even more segments. Well, under the umbrella of data science, you can make an argument that you can be a data engineer, you can be a feature engineer, you can be an ML engineer. And now with AI, we're starting to see that segmentation come a lot faster. And that's because I think I mentioned this earlier on the call, we have two sides of the equation that we need to take into account. The first one is the data side and the data quality side is how do you improve the quality of the data that's being ingested into this models? So if we recall back to how these AI models are being trained, they're utilized all the corpus of the internet. And they're utilizing people in different countries and not doing a lot of I won't dive into that, but they're doing a lot with data annotation and they're putting people through the ringer when it comes to developing this data annotation. But the problem is that takes a really, really long time and it doesn't change the model significantly day to day. We won't see the compounding effects for a couple more years. And so the first side of the equation is thinking about the data infrastructure, the architecture. How are these large language models designed, and how do they then develop more quality outputs? There was a research paper that recently, maybe not recently, came out, but one of the research papers that I was thinking about, and for the life of me, I can't think of the paper, but it was a reinforcement training model where it was looking at positive reinforcement in the outputs. So it was building a small baseline model of maybe 1 billion parameters and testing it for its accuracy. And once it was given a good response, it would be reinforced, and that reinforcement was fed back into the training data set to improve the quality of that data. That is one interesting way of the trying to solve the data quality side and the architecture side. Now, on the other side of the equation is the probability and statistics. The probability and statistics foundations haven't changed significantly in the last 40, 60 plus years. The mathematics hasn't changed. And so when you think about the mathematics, it's more about how can you make more efficient systems so that tokenization maybe is reduced and still gives you a good quality output. So why I say this and why I frame the how to break into AI is you have to think at that global scale of where in that pipeline do you want to start developing and solving problems? Because it's no longer the individual is going to go into an AI company and say, my job is solely focused on working on this ML function. No, it's thinking about, okay, this ML function has a consequence of doing this and XYZ. And how does this interplay with the entire organism in the backdrop? So when I tell people to break into artificial intelligence, or how I tell them to break into artificial intelligence, is one, do a little bit of reading and research on the newest research papers. I won't go into my personal bias onto self-publicated research papers. I think there's a lot of merit and a lot of great information there. I think it is a really good way of getting new knowledge and new information in there. But what I ask my students and the students that seek mentorship is to read papers that are coming out of Nature and MIT Review and so on and so forth, because those are really the papers that have some peer review element to it, some components where there's external validation, and that can give you a really good sense of where the industry is going. And then you can start building your projects around that particular base. For example, one of the students that I'm currently working with is looking on breaking into AI, but they're looking to break into an AI through the interdisciplinary lens. And something that we're developing is a project that utilizes NLP models through large language models to identify bias in court cases. And we were inspired by last week tonight, where they did a segment on felony murder. And so felony murder is this concept here in the United States where even if you weren't involved in the crime, even if you were 20 miles away from when the crime was committed, if your car was utilized as an escape vehicle or there was an accessory that you had used, you can be charged for a murder even if you weren't even at the scene.
Right.
And this is very popular here in the United States. And I believe there was one state where there was 100% conviction of African American men who were convicted of felony murder
Mm,
for these type of charges, which is very, very interesting.
mm,
So now when we think of large language models and NLP, we're thinking of integrating the case studies and downloading from case law, structuring them into text vectors, and understanding um, the patterns in how these cases are addressed, and then giving a report to people, such as the ACLU or the Innocence Project, that will then help people either get acquitted or have their cases retried because there was one statistical anomalies or their cases were super egregious and maybe they didn't have good legal representation. There's a lot of questions to continue to be developed. But
mhm,
why I highlight this experience is because that's the framework and how you should think about breaking into AI. It's finding a way that you're going to utilize these tools to solve a problem that couldn't be solved as easily before. Um, and utilizing these tools, that's going to help you develop kind of part of where you can fit in. And so when we think about this project, it requires data. It needs structured data that's annotated and cleaned. And then we need to make sure that it has the correct sentiments. And then who gets to determine those sentiments based on the actual case law? And then how do we make sure that what we deliver is quality and it's not adding to the bias or making things worse in its deployment?
mm. That's great guidance, Brian. And thank you for all of your thoughtful responses today. This has been such an interesting conversation. I know we're right at the top of the hour, so I don't want to keep people too much longer, but thank you all for joining us today and for your contributions. It's super interesting. We're doing these conversations to better understand our community and how you are using these tools and how we can help support you. So we will continue to do these conversations. We just launched a community insight survey to collect information very similar to this about how you're using AI in your everyday life and in the workplace, and how you're continuing to learning about it, so that we can build programming and resources to help support you in this very rapidly evolving industry. So thank you all. We will this meeting was recorded, so we will be posting on the platform if anybody wants to see it or you want to review it. And we welcome any other thoughts, questions, topics that you'd love for us to talk about, and invite you to participate too if you want to be part of a panel discussion. That would be great. So thank you all. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Amy, and thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.